Good evening, everyone. Good evening. My name is Zach McKinney. I'm an assistant professor of sociology in the Department of Sociology, Criminology, and Human Services. I am also extraordinarily proud to serve as one of the co-directors of the Hartwick Institute of Public Service, along with my marvelous colleagues, Professors Matt Chick and Laurel Elder. So the Institute of Public Service is a nonprofit, nonpartisan, regional political institute that is focused on three key areas, those being state and local government, civic engagement, and legal studies. One of the areas that the Institute has focused its work on recently is also the critical role that journalism plays in our democracy. And so this semester, we were extremely fortunate to be able to collaborate with our local newspaper, the Daily Star, in order to provide free digital subscriptions to the paper for all of our Hartwick students. We also help support our Office of Academic Affairs in providing free digital subscriptions to the New York Times for all of our faculty, staff, and students. And so it's for these reasons and many others that we are very delighted to be joined tonight by David Shribman. And with that being said, I will turn it over to President Mullen, who will introduce Mr. Shribman. Thank you all again so much for coming.
Thank you, Zach. And good evening, everyone. It is a great pleasure for me to join in welcoming a dear friend to the Hartwick campus. I first met David about a decade ago when I was president of Allegheny College in Pennsylvania, and he was the executive editor of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Our friendship formed quickly and over some fundamentals, over a shared love of political history and appreciation for the people who practice politics, over a shared commitment to see young people enter public life, and over a shared love for baseball, a love that led us to a good number of Pittsburgh Pirate baseball games. David is simply one of the truly fine journalists of our time. In addition to his tenure at the Post-Gazette, he covered politics for the Buffalo Evening News and the New York Times. He has served as national political correspondent for the Wall Street Journal and as Washington bureau chief and assistant managing editor of the Boston Globe. He has also been a regular panelist on PBS show Washington Week in Review. In 1995, he earned the Pulitzer Prize in journalism for his coverage of Washington and the American political scene. He also led the coverage of the Tree of Life Synagogue massacre in Pittsburgh that won the Pulitzer Prize for the Post-Gazette a quarter of a century later. David graduated from Dartmouth College, summa cum laude, and is an emeritus member of its Board of Trustees. He also did graduate work as a Reynolds Scholar at Cambridge University in England, where he studied European and African history. And I would note that David is the recipient of 4 honorary degrees, including one from Allegheny that I had the privilege to present. Currently, he and his wife Cindy, herself an emeriti professor at the University of Pittsburgh, split their time between Pittsburgh and Montreal, where David is the J.W. McConnell Professor of the Practice at McGill University's Max Bell School of Public Policy, and where he writes a column for Canada's Globe and Mail, as well as a nationally syndicated column in the United States. And I know all of us are looking forward to David's reflection on the recent election in the United States and what we can expect in the months to come. In particular, for our students here tonight, I'm very pleased that you're about to meet someone who believes passionately in the institutions of our government and a person who believes that serving those institutions is a noble calling that each and every one of you should consider. So with no further ado, a dear friend, a person who embodies the best of what it means to be a journalist, and someone who just drove 6 hours because a friend asked him to do it, David Shribman.
Thank you, President Mullen. Actually, there are a lot of things about Hartwick I'd like to know. One of them is what the attraction is back in the last 6 or 7 rows, because that's where everyone's sitting. I should say that when I got here, I thought of my own college experience. Dartmouth College, the alma mater starts men of Dartmouth give a rouse to the college on the hill. Well, here I am at the college on the hill. I mean, on 3 hills, I guess. Nobody's out of shape in this college, I can tell you that much. I can also say that in 1819, the Supreme Court had an important case. I didn't cover that particular. Okay, here we go. So, 1819, Dartmouth College versus Woodward. And the defender of the college's interests was Daniel Webster, class of 1801. And he didn't have a very strong case. And at the end of the case, he looked at the Supreme Court justices and said, it is a small college, and yet there are those of us who love it. And I think that probably can be said of the college I'm visiting now. So I'm glad to be at a small college that people love. I'll tell you what I'm planning to do. I've written a talk. It's pretty good. But like most writers, I have no idea how long it will take to speak this talk. I know it's about 2,000 words, which is about a column and a half in the newspaper, but I don't know how long it'll take. So I'm just going to ramble on for a while, and when I get tired of talking, I'm going to do what you really want to do, is to take your questions, okay? So I'll start, and when I get a little tired of it, and because I've already read it, obviously, and I get tired of it, I'll stop, and then I'll let you talk, even those of you in the back who are avoiding this as much as you can. You know, it just also, none of this isn't written down. It reminds me of the story of the guy who became a pastor in a church, a new church, and they were developing the plans for the church, and he said, well, why don't you just leave off the front row because no one sits there. Anyhow, this is the prepared stuff, you can tell. An earthquake rumbled through the United States a couple of Tuesdays ago, and the world is feeling its aftershocks. In only a few places and a few modern instances, when the American patriot rebels repelled Great Britain from the 13 colonies, when the French Revolution led to the Napoleonic Wars, when Lenin's Bolsheviks seized power in Russia, when Hitler became Germany's chancellor, did an event in one country have implications that were felt worldwide the way these have been. It's too early and perhaps too facile to suggest that Donald Trump's imminent return to the American presidency is one of those events. But the significance of the election and the prominent, surpassing role that the United States plays in global economics, trade, geopolitics, and culture renders that a plausible notion. That's the fervent hope, of course, of Mr. Trump's adherents, and that, too, is the dreaded fear of his many opponents. But at this juncture, in the aftermath of a searing historic election, it's incontrovertible that the major tectonic changes in the character of the United States are in motion. The first Trump victory was a phenomenon. The second is a trend. And it will bring to office in 2025 a man more resentful and vengeful and less shackled by the conventional and the decorous than he was in 2017, when he seemed more a passing storm than a climactic change. And as a result, seemingly immovable elements of the American political landscape are shaking. Even with the Ronald Reagan anti-government movement of the 1980s, the basic contours of American life remained intact. The size of the government workforce and its share of GNP under Reagan actually increased. And while Mr. Reagan railed against what he called bureaucratic sabotage, the combat against what contemporary conservatives call the deep state was more a skirmish than a war. Mr. Trump is set to undertake a remorseless clash against the very government he will hold. Even with the culture war that conservative commentator and presidential aspirant Pat Buchanan declared in a landmark speech in 1992, that battle was comprised of isolated tussles and surface divisions that didn't disrupt the broadening of American rights and extending them to the disabled, to gay Americans, and in many corners of the United States, also to transgender people. The 2024 Trump campaign put contemporary cultural issues out front, even airing lurid advertisements about trans people during timeouts in NFL games. The support that, among others, white males provided Mr. Trump now is a promissory note for fresh efforts to provide increased parental rights in the content of their children's schools, to restrain trans rights, and at the very least, but perhaps more than that, to discomfort those who support abortion rights in the LGBTQ community. Now, these may be American domestic issues, but in an interdependent world, stitched together by invisible but powerful threads of social media, the boundaries between countries are less rigid than they were even a quarter century ago. Now, national boundaries, of course, are the source of the frisson involving Mr. Trump's key issue, the restrictions on immigration. Those restrictions in the mind of the president-elect and his supporters would be a threat to American sovereignty, and in the mind of their opponents, an immutable value for a country that has embraced huddled masses yearning to breathe free, and whose ancestors were apart from the indigenous families that preceded them to North America and that peopled this area of the country, migrants themselves. Immigration and inflation were, besides cultural matters, the issues that propelled Mr. Trump toward his rendezvous with democratic destiny. Mr. Trump's renaissance and rehabilitation are vaguely reminiscent of the comeback of Richard Nixon, who won the 1968 presidential election after being defeated by Senator John F. Kennedy in 1960, and by the resurgence of Andrew Jackson, who was denied the presidency even though he won a plurality of electoral votes in the popular vote in 1824. I covered that election. It was very good. It was fun. Only to win the White House later in 1828. Now, Mr. Trump is entering an environment where he has very few people in his party willing to check him, and his opposition is almost powerless. Jackson's democratization processes were mostly self-serving. He tried to build a bureaucracy with loyalists, and so we may see a similar effect, and probably already are, in the Trump election. Trump will become the first president since Grover Cleveland, who won his second term in 1892 to lead non-consecutive White House administrations. The difference is that the 24th president, that's Cleveland's, second term was, according to Troy Selleck, who wrote a book about Cleveland, at odds with the political trends of the day. Instead, Mr. Trump's second ascendancy is reflecting the political trends of the day. And we may talk a little bit later in the question period about whether Trump is causing those changes or reflecting them. But in one way or another, it sets in motion questions about civil liberties, economic policy, national defense, abortion, the status of minorities, and his own legal status. It raises the question about whether a leader of a country, based on the notion that no person is above the law, can pardon himself. It prompts an uncomfortable but unavoidable question of what message a pardon of those accused of crimes growing out of the January 6th Capitol riot would send after Mr. Trump, in his second taking of the oath, is the beneficiary of the peaceful transfer of power. And I might remind you that the peaceful transfer of power this time will be presided over on January 6, 2025, by the Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris. Now, Donald Trump has tested the limits of politics before, as we know. He tried to overturn an election and convinced the entire party and a good portion of the public that he was robbed of a second term. He inspired the mob we just spoke about to invade the Capitol, suffered no penalty for it. He was indicted 4 times and now appears certain to escape prison. He introduced vulgar language and bizarre behavior into campaign rallies, and he won the 2024 election. Now, with his cabinet nominations, he may finally have run up against the boundaries of what Washington will tolerate. Maybe he hasn't, though. One way or the other, by selecting figures who, from the point of view of mainstream Washington, are nothing short of political outlaws, Mr. Trump is making a statement, one heard unmistakably in the halls of the Capitol's bureaucracy, where many of the denizens of the deep state that he so reviles have begun preparing their resumes and plotting their resignations. One of them called me today on the phone while I was driving. Don't tell my wife that I took the call. It was from her nephew. These selections are as a vivid display not only of Mr. Trump's preference for loyalists, but also of his contempt for conventional politics, his distaste for the totems and taboos of the Capitol, and his broad hostility to government institutions and established political ways. The latest expression, as you all know, came with his announcement that he'll nominate Bobby Kennedy Jr. as Secretary of Health and Human Services, install former Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard as Director of National Intelligence, and put former Representative Matt Gaetz in the Justice Department. Now, none of these three apparent nominees is remotely considered a mainstream figure. Mr. Kennedy is regarded as a fringe gadfly in many matters of public health. Ms. Gabbard faces serious questions about her friendly views on the leaders of Syria and Russia. Mr. Gaetz is a radical who toppled a House Speaker, has alienated most of his congressional colleagues, has attracted a series of ethical investigations, and has the contempt of many of his peers, most of whom loathe him. Now, Mr. Kennedy is the oldest son of the former Senator Robert F. Kennedy, who ran a Democratic presidential candidacy, then campaigned as an independent, this is Bobby Kennedy Jr., only to withdraw and endorse President Trump, and then appear frequently with him. Now, the president-elect has said of him, he's going to help make America healthy again. Go have a good time, Bobby. So now, Bobby is Mr. Trump's selection to run the sprawling department that includes, among other agencies, the Food and Drug Administration and the Centers of Disease Control, two bodies that regulate areas where Mr. Kennedy's positions are at odds with those of most health professionals. His cries of alarm about obesity, his criticism of high fructose corn syrup, and his desire to ban processed food from school lunches have won wide acceptance among public health experts. But his views on the supposed dangers of vaccines and his aberrant behavior has promoted criticism, even horror, among his many health professionals. In the Atlantic magazine the other day, Benjamin Mazur, a Johns Hopkins University pathologist, described Mr. Kennedy as a grade A crank. I actually spoke with Donna Shalala, who served as HHS secretary for 8 years under President Bill Clinton. This is what she said. Bobby Kennedy is not qualified to run a big, complex agency like HHS. He has a set of views that are in conflict with science and are dangerous to public health. There are plenty of responsible Republicans who are Trump supporters who could run that department. It's an awful appointment. Similarly, the appointment of Mr. Gaetz has raised alarms. The former congressman who resigned his seat after his selection was investigated by the Justice Department for allegedly having sex with a 17-year-old and violating sex trafficking laws, though he was not charged. He once sought a presidential pardon himself from Mr. Trump. The first test of the new Senate leadership will be whether it allows Mr. Trump to install these nominees and others as recess appointments, permitting them to evade hearings and confirmation votes. It's entirely possible, however, that Mr. Trump doesn't intend for any of these people to be confirmed. It's possible that these appointments were announced with the intention of signaling the extent of change the new president wants to impose, but with the quiet assumption that if these nominations fail, and they very well may, he can return to the well of MAGA talent and win confirmation of figures who aren't as well known. A new set of nominees could have the attributes and attitudes of his original choices, but without the apparent problems. So I've just run out of things that I've written, but I haven't run out of things to say. So I'm going to take a little sip of water and invite your questions. And you raise your hand, and I'll point in the general direction of you, and you can stand up and play Stump the Wizard.
Okay, I'll ask myself some questions. Oh, you do have questions. Okay, is there one back there? Okay. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to repeat the question. Do I think that the second term of Trump, the president will be more effective because he knows his way around? Well, you know, you never know with President Trump. I can answer that. You know, Harry Truman once said that he wanted a one-handed economist because he was tired of having people tell him on the one hand, on the other. But I have two hands here. On the one hand, he's Trump totally unleashed, right? And he does know his way around Washington a little bit, though he hasn't paid much attention to much, as you know. On the other hand, he had established people who knew Washington and knew how Washington worked the first time around. He's gone through all those, there aren't many of those left, and the people he's inviting to power don't know Washington as well, and so he may run into more trouble rather than less. So I don't really know. It's an excellent question, and since I'm desperate for a column for Sunday, I think I'll take the idea, so thanks. And you see, I'll kind of hem and haw and say, well, maybe this, maybe that, and it'll get me to 800 words and I'll be fine. Yes. Yes, you. No.
Oh, hang on one sec.
Oh, you were doing it with the microphones? Okay.
So, kind of a two-parter, I guess. You said you don't see any of his...
Well, hang on. Where are you? Okay, very good. I can't see you because of the light. Okay, very good. Oh, you're back in the bleachers there. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, you said you didn't see his cabinet appointees sticking around very long, or I suppose not getting, what's the term?
Hearing.
Affirmed.
Affirmed.
Right?
Okay, fine. Yep.
Which do you think is the most likely to succeed if any of them actually make it through? And I guess to that end, if they do end up succeeding and sticking around, do you think, or what do you think the likelihood of the chances that he alienates himself from them throughout his term, like we saw with a lot of his advisors in his last administration?
Well, it's plausible that none of them will be confirmed, and it's possible that most of them will be confirmed, but I'm guessing that it's extremely unlikely for Getz to be confirmed. I can't imagine the House Foreign Relations Committee, if Gabbard's appointment goes to that committee, sending her nomination to the floor. I have a hard time seeing whatever committee, the Senate committee that the Kennedy nomination gets. I think he's probably the most plausible, but it's a guess. I mean, it's a guess. I don't really know. Oh, I guess I don't have control over who it is, so I'm going to, go ahead.
Well, I have the mic, and it may be a question that Harvey Michaels might have been interested in.
Well, there you go. And how do we know?
Swampscott High School, 1967.
Okay, and I'm Swampscott High School 72. And did you know that the Swampscott Marblehead game, which is the high school game that the two of us care most deeply about, is going to be on Wednesday night before Thanksgiving, not Thanksgiving, at Fenway Park.
Unless the Marblehead teachers are on strike, my granddaughter is one of the Swampscott cheerleaders.
Well, great.
Now-
And hang on, he and I are not done yet. First of all, let me say cheer, cheer for Old Swampscott High. I'll bring the whiskey, you bring the rye. Go ahead.
Well, I was just saying, you did write briefly about my cousin Lloyd Benson,
Yes,
was one
I
of
have
Dick
written.
Geron's linemen.
I did not plant this guy. I don't even know who the hell he is. What's your name, sir?
My name is Bill Simons, and for 45 years I taught at the other college in town, SUNY Oneonta.
And what street did you live on?
What state where
Street did you live on?
I'm sorry?
What street did you grow up on?
I grew up, I lived initially on Phillips Street near the Willie House, which is why I have the Hadley School here, and then we moved to Sheridan Road.
Okay, we all thought the Woolly House was a poorhouse, but go ahead.
It was.
Okay.
It was indeed.
All right, now
Okay,
let's get to the
so
business
the question,
here.
what impact do you think Donald Trump's election will have both for U.S. policy toward Israel, and also what impact will it have on American Jews?
Well, I gave a talk. I should tell you about my own background so you know where I'm coming from. I'm Jewish. My wife is Catholic. Our daughter's a rabbi.
you can tell what a mixed up family we are. So I gave a talk at the big synagogue in Montreal the other day, not unlike this, but not exactly this. And I explained that 79% of American Jews voted for Harris, and that of the 11 most important issues in the campaign, American Jews ranked Israel number 9. A gentleman over there in the corner stood up and said, "You lie. You're a liar." Went on and on like that. That was the high point. It got worse. But the impact on Israel, I think many Israelis are pleased with the election of Trump. Surely Benjamin Netanyahu, who can use any friend he can get, is very happy about it. I think some of the Arab Americans who didn't vote for Harris in Michigan will be disappointed by the Trump administration, which, as you know, moved the American embassy to Jerusalem. No other president, every other president said that he would do it, but none of them ever did because they never had any intention of doing it. But Trump did it, and so I think that's basically the long and the short of it. American Jews have voted Democratic in every election since 1932. Actually, since 1920, they voted heavily for Harding, I think, but not for Wilson. Twice in 1932 and 1936 for FDR, and once for LBJ in '64. 90% of American Jews voted for the Democrat. 79% is about average for a Democrat among the Jewish vote, but let's not get carried away here. It's only 2% of the country, and it's important in New York and California, which weren't going to be competitive anyhow, and it didn't make any difference in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, where it could have. So there you go. You and I will talk later.
Hiya. So you talked about how Trump is targeting gender-affirming care for children under the ruse of parental rights, but how do you feel about him trying to expand that to gender-affirming care for trans people in general?
Well, how I feel about things is irrelevant. What's relevant is how the president feels. He's clearly not going to be congenial to this sort of thing. Without any, my guess is without any deep conviction of his own, he saw political advantage in, I have to say, cynical way during the election. In my lifetime, the three most effective television ads were the 1964 ad from Barry Goldwater, against Barry Goldwater by LBJ, that suggested that he was a maniac with atomic weapons. The 1984 ad of Ronald Reagan that had picket fences and puppy dogs and said America is sleeping well again, or it's morning in America. And the 2024 ad that said Kamala is for they, them, and Trump is for you. Now that clearly was a rocket shot at the progressive left and to people who have LGBTQ people in their families, and particularly trans people and others. And so I think it's going to be a lot of heavy weather ahead. Many of his acolytes feel very strongly, or no, I don't know if they feel strongly. They use strong language. So you'll notice I'm being careful on what I say. I don't think these folks necessarily believe a lot of this, but they certainly believe there's political advantage in it. So I think there's heavy weather ahead.
Yes. To what extent do you attribute the election to the billionaire-owned and controlled media? And as far as appointments are concerned, Trump will just give temporary appointments, just as he previously had done. So the checks and balances really won't matter anymore, and we're really going to be under a dictatorship. Your thoughts and comments, please.
Well, I want to take issue with part of the premise about the billionaire owned media. So I worked for the billionaire-owned media, though I think many of them, if they're heavily invested in the media, are millionaires, if not thousandaires right now. They may have been wearing Gucci's, but they're barefoot this morning. So I worked for the New York Times, which is the most, and the Boston Globe, the two most liberal newspapers, and the Wall Street Journal, which is clearly the most conservative one. And in neither case did anyone tell me what to write, or to say, or to think. So all this talk, this claptrap, I'm sorry to say, about corporate ownership of the media and how they control our thoughts, they don't, no one's ever told me what to say or think. There's some days when I look at a blank screen and don't know what to write for my column. I've written column without missing one for, I think, 29 years now. I wish someone would tell me what to say. But no one ever has. And I ran a newspaper for 16 years, and it was owned by billionaires, and they didn't tell me what to say. So I will dispose of that. Now, the other part of the question, I think, is a serious question, and it's whether this is a dictatorship. Well, I don't know, and you don't either. But I would say this, that there have been times in our country's history, and you and I lived through one of them, where a party held both houses of Congress, the White House, and a clear majority in the Supreme Court. And that was from 1961 to 1969. And that wasn't a dictatorship. This is a different period, a different person. There's no Cold War, but there's certainly cultural wars raging. I have to go back to what Bismarck said. Not in an interview with me, but he said that the Lord God gives his providential protection to drunkards, the mentally ill in the United States of America. And so I think maybe you and I can join together and hope that this might be the one time you and I think that we hope that Bismarck's right. Next.
Oh, hi. Hi. Oh, that was loud. You said that unlike Cleveland, Trump is reflecting the political trends of the time and that he might even be causing them. And I guess I just wanted to know, do you think there is considerable proof that he is causing them, that he's more than just a vehicle for these trends, and that it's kind of like a cycle of him influencing his followers and his followers influencing him?
You know, that is, if you're thinking of getting a PhD, that would be a great thesis to write. Or if you're teaching, and it would be a great final exam question. Is he the cause or consequence of this uprising of upsurge in populism? And I don't know, but I suspect there's a little bit of each. I suspect that there was tinder on the ground that the spark of Trump ignited. I think that he could not have prevailed in 1962 or 63, when the John Birch Society, with many of the same kinds of views, went nowhere. Even in the 40s or the 30s, when Father Coughlin and on the one hand, and the Epic End Poverty in California movement, 1934, on the left, they they didn't, they had brief flames, but then they kind of petered out. This one didn't peter out. So I think there must have been some tinder on the ground that that was ready to be ignited. So I think it's a combination. I think he did it brilliantly. I don't know that he knew what he was doing, but I do have a theory about why he is the way he is, and why he, so someone's bound to ask this, so I'll just short circuit this. Why does Trump feel, David, why does Trump feel that he is the spokesperson for the people who are left behind and ignored and dissed, etc.? And I think if you look at Trump's own life, he has all of the attributes of the people he loathes. He's wealthy, he's well-educated. Not only well-educated, he has an Ivy League degree. He's a big shot in New York, you know, the kind of the central, the capital of elitism. And he was shunned by all the people he wanted acceptance from. Nobody in the elites, wealthy or educational and intellectual corners of New York wanted Donald Trump at their dinner party. Nobody wanted to go to any party that Donald Trump had. Nobody wanted to design their home with the kind of glitzy crapola that Trump had in his apartments. And so he felt dissed, he felt ignored, he felt he was an object of contempt, and he was. And so he was the perfect prophet for this movement. And don't forget, even among the Democratic Party, the two greatest spokespersons for, well, two of the three, I'll leave Lyndon Johnson out, the two greatest spokespersons for progressivism and liberalism in the Democratic Party were millionaires, John Kennedy and Franklin Roosevelt.
I wanted to inquire quickly in regards to...
You're going to have to speak a little louder and a little slower.
In today's world, we see a much higher polarization in regards to the media influence and how everything is shown. And going over how you have looked at politics over decades of research, what do you feel is the influence of this higher polarization, and what is the effect of it on the moderate climate and the effect of people seeing an eye of hopelessness of, my view doesn't change anything?
Well, you know, I think the answer to your question is much like the answer to hers, is I don't know whether the polarization is the cause or consequence of all this. But I suspect that it's a mutually reinforcing system. There must be somebody here who teaches biology and can explain mutually, you know, how they work together and cause, you know, actually just consider climate change as one of those examples. There was a time in our lifetime, in President Mullen's lifetime, in your parents' lifetime, where everybody had the same information. They watched one of the three TV stations, ABC, CBS, or NBC. If they were in New York, they read the Herald Tribune or the New York Times or the Daily News, or or if they were really liberal, the New York Post. That'll surprise you. If they lived in Washington, they read the Washington Star. They didn't really bother with the Washington Post. There was nothing in those days. And so everybody knew the same stuff. And when I was hired at the New York Times, the editor of the New York Times, he has this moment where it's kind of like the laying on of hands, you know. It's a very sober and sacred moment when he brings you into the fraternity, largely a fraternity, at the time of the New York Times, and he talks to you about the specialness. In my case, talks to me about this before he fired me 3 years later for insubordination, about the specialness of the New York Times, and he said the following, and it's true. You have to assume that anywhere in America where an educated or important person runs into another educated or important person at 9 a.m. in the morning, they each will assume of the other that they've read the New York Times. That's no longer the case. So, big difference. Next.
Okay. So, like, Trump nominating cabinet members such as RFK for the health department despite the fact he's against vaccinations, Matt Gaetz for attorney general despite the fact that he has sexual allegations and sex trafficking allegations.
This is a student who's paying attention.
Well, I already knew this prior, but Elon Musk, like, for department efficiency despite he lost money, Twitter value and all that. And the
Are you saying that there's some inconsistency in politics?
UN representative that has, like, no experience. What?
No, she has some experience. I mean, she's,
Like, but she's,
but there are other questions about her, but go ahead.
yeah. What is his, like, actual plan with this? Because if they don't get confirmed, like, what is the plan? What happens after that?
So you're asking someone to tell you what's in Donald Trump's mind?
Like, I guess, like, what happens if they're not confirmed?
He comes up with some other people.
Oh, amazing.
You know, President Carter nominated Ted Sorensen to be head of the CIA, and he didn't make it and nominated somebody else. There are plenty of people who want those jobs, and many of them are qualified for them, and he'll find one. Yeah, just keep going. Yeah, yeah. That's why you should keep reading the paper, because you have to keep up with it. Yeah.
Hi. It seems to me that underlying a lot of the trends that we're talking about and what Trump was tapping into is basic misogyny. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are about how gender has played a role in this election.
I have a wife, 2 daughters, and a female cat. I live in feminist nation. It's my home. Whether this was misogyny or whether the result is misogynistic qualities is a subtle question. I won't get into that. But I do think that the gender gap tells you a whole lot about this election. In the 2000 election, I think you could determine, you could say, if you went to church last week, you'd know who you voted for. You voted for Bush. If you didn't go to church, you voted for Gore. In this election, if you were male, you pretty much voted for Trump, and if you're female, you pretty much, now of course I'm oversimplifying, but the Trump people understood that they were courting a male audience, mobilizing a male audience, and using the fact that women were so ardently on the other side as a weapon to get men hopped up and to vote for Trump. This was a blatant, I mean, his ads were all over NFL football. You know, NFL games are usually it's, you can tell by looking at the ads. For example, if you look at the evening news, NBC, CBS, ABC, you'll see a lot of products for geriatric health, okay? You'll see a lot of products for medicines that you can't imagine anybody wanting after the side effects are described. And if you watch NFL football, you'll think that the President of the United States believes that only men can vote. Is that misogynistic? Is that political opportunism? Has political opportunism taken a misogynistic tense? You can see I'm kind of weaseling out of this because I don't really know, but I don't think that the Trump team really targeted a lot of female votes. Now, whether that's misogynistic, connotes utter hatred, or whether it's opportunism, cynical opportunism, I think it's probably the latter, but I'm not quite sure. There's certainly many of the views of his adherents are at odds with many women who believe in abortion rights, for example. But I have to remind you that many women, not many, but some women don't believe in abortion rights. So.
Hello. My question is going to be a little more focused on the election results as a whole, more specifically with the polls. So for the past few months, I've been keeping up with the different polls and the different poll sites and getting an understanding in terms of where things were going. And basically, even though every poll nationally was showing it being within the margin of error, which means technically you could be either candidate, it always showed just a slight margin towards Harris.
Well, not
Now-
always, not always.
Not always,
but
not
often,
always, but
often,
majority
often,
I saw.
often,
So,
yeah.
yes. But so my question now, with the results that the election came, do you feel that the public is going to sway away from the polls or different pollsters because of the inaccuracies of many of the different polls that are widely available?
Well, you know, pollsters always know that what they're spewing out is likely to be inaccurate, which is why they have the margins of error. And they always, after every election, having failed to predict the winner, try to compensate. So I was thinking during the election that these pollsters, some of whom I know, know that they're wrong, they just don't know which way they're wrong. Well, now we know. Here are the problems with polls. They used to be a little more, they weren't always accurate, first of all. In 1936, the biggest magazine, you've never heard of this magazine, but the biggest magazine, and most respected magazine in the United States in 1936 was a magazine called the Literary Digest. And it was known for its political poll, which predicted, I think, Harding and Coolidge, and then Hoover, and then Roosevelt, right? So I'm guessing 4 in a row, but I'm not quite sure. Maybe it was just 3. And so the Literary Digest in 1936 said that Alf Landon, you remember President Landon, Alf Landon was going to win the 1936 election against FDR. And of course, there were only 48 states and he lost 46 of them, okay? So the Literary Digest, one of the reasons you don't get it today, is that it went out of business right away. These pollsters don't go out of business because most of them have corporate clients who want to know, whether you think Coke Zero is better than Diet Coke, or whether you think, some kind of consumer stuff, whether you prefer Lay's potato chips to the Ruffles versus the flat ones or whatever. And so they have plenty of other ways to stay in business. And doing politics is kind of a hobby for many of them. And idiots like me use them. And, we call them up and ask them. And then we throw them in our stories indiscriminately. And we mislead the public that way. And it's been a pretty good business model for all of us. We'll probably do it again next time. But I think the follow-up question would be, how, David, do you use polls? I don't write stories about polls. I use polls in stories. So in other words, if I see something and then I check it against the polls, and sometimes it tells you you're right, sometimes it tells you you're wrong, and sometimes they're advantageous in explaining things. But I don't like to do stories that say Kamala Harris is 4 points ahead. I think that's dangerous, and I don't think it's, they've said for generations the only poll that counts is in November, and I still think that's the case. You'll notice the skill with which I evade most of these questions.
Hello.
Yeah, hi.
So back in 2020, we saw probably one of the largest waves of political activism in this country, with both the Black Lives Matter movement and political protests of all kind. Whereas here in 2024, we've seen crickets in comparison, even though, tensions and emotions are just as high. Why do you think that is?
You guys must think I know everything. I don't know. There's a lot of activism on campuses in the East on the Gaza war. There's a lot. I think
First of all, there was a lot of activism and tensions among students in 1968, when you all forget that one of the candidates for president in 1968 was George Corley Wallace, George C. Wallace, who had been, I don't think at the time he was governor of Alabama, and who was a devout segregationist. So there's been other times of great student involvement. 1940, 1940, there was a lot of student ferment about staying out of the war. In England, a couple of years earlier, the Oxford Debating Society voted not to support king or country and go to war. There were, in many college campuses, a lot of isolationist ferment. A lot of that was stoked, Trump-like, by Charles Lindbergh, a character much like Trump in some ways. So we have student ferment comes and goes. There was a lot of student ferment, mostly for fermented alcoholic beverages in the 50s. And then in the 60s, during the student protests on civil rights, all those students who went down in the freedom rides, 4 of whom were killed. You saw an upsurge then in the 63, 64, 65. It comes and goes. And some of it's imitative, I think, too. So, again, I'm just talking to try to answer the question, but I don't know the answer, really. I hope someone asks me a question that I do know the answer to, but it hasn't happened yet tonight. Yes, sir.
Hi. You made comparisons throughout your talk between some of the ads that Reagan ran, ads that Trump ran, and just kind of comparisons between the two. And I think they're very similar candidates, but who do you see, do you think a similar candidate to these two, like a big personality, very much on their own side of the spectrum, not a very moderate candidate, do you think we'll see that sort of candidate in the 2024 election, either being put up by the Democrats or the Republicans?
You mean 28, you mean 28?
28, yes.
Okay, but first of all, I don't mean to be pedantic here, but there's almost no comparison between Ronald Reagan, who was a sunny optimist, and Donald Trump, who was not an optimist. Between Ronald Reagan, who was the president of a union, an active Democrat who became a Republican, and who served 2 terms as governor of California, and someone who was the only president never to have served in the military or had political office before. And there was a huge difference between Reagan, who respected expertise, and he had some wacky ideas, but Jimmy Carter had some wacky ideas too. So I don't think they're really comparable, but that wasn't the spine of your question. I think the spine of the question was, will the country revert to a more moderate? And I think the answer is yes, and I think that might surprise you. But are you a student here? Okay, so Harvard and Tufts, at the center of elitism in America, of course, in Massachusetts, have done a lot of polling of young people. And what's really interesting to me, and no one's paying attention to it, I wrote a column about it, but it's really interesting to me is that younger people, people who are in college now, or not in college, your age, agree on almost everything. You agree on all of the things that are driving your parents and grandparents apart. You agree about abortion. You agree about immigration. You agree upon LGBTQ rights. You agree upon immigration. Okay? You believe in immigration. Okay? The kinds of issues that are driving your parents and grandparents apart are not issues for you. So I know your parents say grow up, but I can't wait till you grow up. Not for your behavior, because your generation, I think, will bring us back to the center. You should check those polls. They're really interesting. You guys agree on everything.
I think that we have time for one more question. If anyone has a final question for Mr. Shribman.
Thank you. Before you said that there would be different world consequences because of America's role as a world power and the economic ties. What can you specifically go into that, or say Taiwan, say oil, like just what more?
Okay, well,
Very
Taiwan,
factual.
Taiwan and oil you can predict, okay? But here's what you might find interesting. After World War II, the United States established the principal elements of what you might call the world order, okay? The United Nations was founded in San Francisco and had its headquarters in Turtle Bay in New York. The United States helped create the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. The United States was the driving factor behind NATO, still the most consequential alliance probably since Napoleon, okay? The anti-Napoleon movement. And the United States, beginning in 1947, undertook the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe and even offered Marshall Plan money to the Soviet Union. So all of those things are the opinions and the structures behind the world order, and Trump is against most of them. So that's what I meant. Okay,
Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking Mr. Shribman for his talk.
Thank you.